When you think of Irish famine, one big event probably jumps to mind: the Great Hunger of the 1840s. But what if I told you that a century before that, a famine that was proportionally even more devastating hit the island? It was a catastrophe born from an almost apocalyptic climate event. It's a story that's been largely forgotten, one we've had to piece together from two very different kinds of clues: cold, hard scientific data and the raw, emotional verses of 18th century poetry. Comes from hell, the vengeful cold. Wow. Those are the words of a poet, William Duncan, writing in the middle of it all, in 1740. You can just feel the sheer terror in that line, can't you? This wasn't just another cold winter. To the people living through it, this felt like something supernatural, an assault capable of literally wiping life off the face of the island. So, what exactly was this catastrophe that inspired such horror? Well, in this explainer, we're going to unpack the story of the Great Frost. And to do it right, we're going to look at it through two totally different lenses. First, we'll dig into the science, the data that tells us what happened. And then we'll turn to the art, the poetry written at the time that tells us what it felt like. So let's start with the science. Okay, so our story begins not with politics, not with economics, but with the weather. The trigger for this whole disaster was a sudden, severe, and, crucially, a prolonged climate shock that caught absolutely everyone off guard. You know, modern climate reconstructions have confirmed what the poets were saying. This wasn't just a bad winter. It was a genuine climate anomaly. A huge, stable, high-pressure ridge basically parked itself over the Atlantic. It acted like a giant wall, funneling intensely cold, dry polar air right over Ireland. And it stayed there for months. It was the perfect meteorological storm for creating a catastrophe. And this just brilliantly illustrates how extreme it really was. Now, this isn't poetry. This is a newspaper report from Dublin. The River Liffey, which flows right through the capital, froze so solid that people were setting up tables on the ice and selling drinks. There were even plans for a full-on barbecue to roast an ox on the frozen river. I mean, this wasn't just cold. This was a complete transformation of the landscape. So here's the crucial point. While the extreme cold was the trigger, it wasn't the sole cause of the famine. The cold snap hit a society that was already incredibly vulnerable, a society basically balanced on a knife's edge. Let's take a look at why. So even before the frost began, Ireland had some deep, deep problems. The entire agricultural system was dangerously dependent on just two crops, potatoes and oats, both of which were totally wiped out by the frost. The political system was designed to exclude the vast majority of people. There was no national system for relief, no social safety net. Add to that a recent population boom and widespread illiteracy, and you have a recipe for absolute disaster. There was simply no buffer, no resilience to absorb a shock this big. And we really have to understand this key political context. The penal laws were a system of oppression that basically made the vast Catholic majority powerless. They couldn't own land, they couldn't get an education, they couldn't participate in government. So think about it. When this crisis hit, most of the population had no political power, no economic security, and no official channels to even ask for help. The vulnerability was baked right into the structure of society.
So we've seen the data, we've seen the social context, but what did it actually feel like to live through this, to watch your world freeze and starve? Well, for that, we have to turn away from the scientific records and look at a different kind of evidence: the poems written by people who were actually there. These verses are just invaluable. They give us a raw, human account of the crisis.
Look at this imagery from William Duncan: crystal coalition with the deep. It's so beautiful, but it's also completely terrifying. He's describing a world brought to a dead stop. It starts with the water, the very source of life, freezing solid. The fish, the seals, everything is just trapped, suspended in a frozen state of non-existence. It's like the natural energy of the world had just been switched off. And here, Thomas Delamain shows us the direct, desperate struggle for survival. The cattle are starving, blowing on the frozen ground, just trying to find a blade of grass. And humans are so thirsty, they're trying to chop water out of frozen rivers with an axe. This isn't some abstract tragedy. It's about the fundamental, back-breaking effort just to get a single drink of water. You know, this is one of the most haunting details, and it was recorded by a lot of people. The silence. The cold was so severe, it killed the birds. Can you imagine waking up not to birdsong, but to an eerie, unnatural quiet? It was this profound symbol of a world where the music of life had just stopped. The melody was over. Man, this line from Lawrence White just captures the sheer speed of the social collapse. It's a devastating observation. The people who are now begging for food are the very same people who, just a few months earlier, were able to give charity to others. It shows how quickly the crisis just erased the line between who was secure and who was desperate, overwhelming entire communities and turning pretty much everyone into a victim.
So now let's bring our two lenses back together. We've heard the poet's descriptions of the suffering. What does the data tell us about the real-world consequences? Well, the aftermath was every bit as grim as the poem suggests.
13%. Modern estimates suggest that in 1740 and 1741, up to 13% of the entire population of Ireland died from starvation and the diseases that came with it. Now, to put that in perspective, the mortality rate of the Great Famine a century later was around 12%. This forgotten famine was proportionally just as deadly, if not more so. And here we can see the economic engine of the famine. With the potato and oat crops completely gone, destroyed by the frost, people turned to other grains like wheat. But there just wasn't enough. Demand went through the roof, and the price more than doubled. It created this horrible situation where even if food was available in the markets, it was priced so high that millions of people simply could not afford to buy it. They were priced out of survival. And this slide really shows the two faces of that desperation. In private, people resorted to eating what they called famine foods, literally anything to fill their stomachs, from weeds like nettles and charlock to spoiled milk, even rotten potatoes. But in public, that desperation boiled over into unrest. In cities like Dublin, riots broke out. People stormed bakeries, not just to steal bread, but to sell it at what they considered a fair price. You could feel society just fracturing under the strain. For many, there was only one coping strategy left: to leave. Today, we have a term for this: climate-induced migration. It's actually seen as a form of adaptation, what people do when all other options have failed. In the 18th century, they didn't have the term, but they certainly lived the reality.
And the data makes this connection absolutely crystal clear. This timeline shows Irish migration to North America in the 18th century. There are several waves, but look at that one, a massive spike right in 1740 and 1741. That's not a coincidence. That is the direct evidence of thousands of people fleeing a climate-driven catastrophe, taking a dangerous journey across the Atlantic because it was still a better option than staying home.
So why does this forgotten story, this ghost from the 18th century, still matter today? Well, because the lessons it holds about the relationship between climate, politics, and society are more relevant now than they've ever been. The key lesson is this: the disaster wasn't just the weather. The disaster was the collision. It was the collision of an extreme climate event with a society that had already been made fragile and unequal by its political and economic systems. Extreme weather doesn't create fractures in a society. It reveals the ones that are already there. Vulnerability, it turns out, is almost always a man-made condition. And finally, think about how we even managed to uncover this story. We needed both ways of knowing. The scientific data gave us the scale, the temperature anomalies, the mortality rates, the migration numbers. But the poetry gave us its soul. It translated all that data into human experience, into fear and desperation and silence. To truly understand the past, we need both. Which leaves us with a final question. Centuries from now, when people look back on our era and on our own climate challenges, what story will they tell? What will our spreadsheets and our scientific models show? And what will our art, our poems, our films, our songs say about what it felt like to live through it all? What will they say about us?